Good morning. Listen to the challenging words in the Gospel of Luke. One day Jesus was praying, and when he had finished, one of his disciples asked, "Rabbi, teach us to pray, just as John taught his disciples." Jesus said to them, "When you pray, say, 'God, hallowed be your name. May your reign come. Give us today tomorrow's bread. Forgive us our sins, for we too forgive everyone who sinned against us. And don't let us be subjected to the test.'" Jesus said to them, "Suppose one of you has a friend, a neighbour, and you go to your neighbour at midnight and say, 'Lend me 3 loaves of bread, because friends of mine are on a journey, have come to me, and I have nothing to set before them.' Then your neighbour says, 'Leave me alone. The door is already locked, and the children and I are in bed. I can't get up to look after your needs.' I tell you, though, your neighbour will not get up to give you the bread out of friendship. Your persistence will make your neighbour get up and give you as much as you need. That's why I tell you, keep asking and you'll receive. Keep looking and you'll find. Keep knocking and the door will be open to you. For whoever asks receives. Whoever seeks finds. Whoever knocks is admitted. What parents among you will give you a snake to their child when the child asks for a fish? Still others, to test Jesus, were demanding a sign from heaven. Jesus knew what they were really thinking and said to them, "Every nation divided against itself will be ruined, and the house divided against itself will fall. In the realm of Satan is divided against itself, how can it stand? Since you say, 'It's by Beelzebul that I cast out demons,' if I cast out demons by Beelzebul, by whom do your present people cast them out? In that case, let them act as your judges. But if it is by the finger of God that I cast out demons, then the reign of God has come upon you. For the gifts of divine love and relationship, for the promise of unity and reconciliation, for diversity in communion."
Hope everyone can see. I prefer to sit. I think it changes the dynamics of the conversation that we're going to have. Thank you for the privilege of being here. I've been to a couple of these kind of events over the years and have had the privilege of talking to you, so thank you for that. You will have met Nathan Tyson last week, my good friend Nathan. Nathan and I tend at times to do a kind of cooperative act together. His job is to tell you what he and his people feel, and he entrusts me with the job of telling you as a second person what we ought to do about it. I was talking to him yesterday. He said, "You always are able to say things I cannot say." So there you go. I want to say something else before I start. I know this community more than most struggle with language about God and divine life and other things because the language has deep, troublesome history. And I, like you, live in the midst of that ambiguity, partly because the language of God for me carries a story. And if I don't use that language, I lose the story. So divine life carries another story. I'm not saying the God story is always healthy, but so I'm caught in an ambiguity. So if I slip in and out of God language and divine life language in the middle of this reflection, please gracefully bear with me and know that I am living, in fact, in the same tension that you are and trying to balance a story with not a story, if you like, around life. My other introductory comment is that I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave the Bible passages for today for you to go home and wrestle with, because I have chosen to talk today about covenant and reconciliation. 2 really important issues for the Uniting Church, which actually shape the way in which we attend to the relationship between first and second peoples. So in 1994, after a bit of upheaval in the life of the church, in which the church, as is usually the case, refused to listen to Aboriginal people about some important issues that led to the bicentennial, the church committed itself to build covenanted relationships between first and second peoples. It was an act that was established in confession. Confession that the church had managed to not listen to first peoples, had frequently ignored their wisdom and voice, and had cooperated in the invasion and the colonial occupation of this space. The church chose the language of covenant as an acknowledgement that the relationship between first and second peoples, between the Assembly in particular and the Uniting Aboriginal and Islander Christian Congress, was one of deep significance. Covenants point to relationships. They point to promise. And they point to trust. In the biblical world, covenant was something that could happen between peoples. So we often read that when one of the ancestors of Israel went into a new place, they did covenant with those people to figure out how they were going to do stuff. Or they're covenants that go on between God and the people of Israel, like the covenant God made with Abraham. The word for covenant in the Bible is exactly the same word as treaty. And Mark Brett, who's an Australian Old Testament scholar, says to us that Israel deliberately chose this ambiguous word covenant and treaty as a kind of colonial pushback against those powers around them that were constantly imposing treaties on top of Israel to make them subservient nations. And Israel used this word to say to it and the nations around them, well, listen, before we get into this, you've got to understand that we have a treaty with our God. And because we have a treaty with our God, then there's a limit to the kind of treaty we can make with you. So Brett says to us that the language of treaty was kind of mimicry. You pick up the language of those that oppress you and you use it back against them to make space for yourself. But the really important issue is that whether it's covenant or treaty in Israel, it was always about land. It was always about the shape of the political economy. It was always about the nature of the way in which we love the neighbour as we are meant to love ourselves. It was never simply about relationships. It was never simply about making things better so that we're better friends than we used to be. It was always about where does the land fit in the life of us and God? What does it mean in terms of land and economy and politics to love our neighbour? That's why in Israel you find things like the rest on the Sabbath so that the land can have rest. That's why you have such things as the Jubilee, where every 49, 50 years people give back the land that's been taken from them because of debt to make an equal community again. The problem is for us in the Uniting Church, for whom covenant has become such a significant matter, we want to keep making it about relationships. Relationships as an end in themselves. Let's us second people be good mates with first people. Let's get on with each other, rather than how can the building of friendships enable us to take the next step in the journey towards a more just political and social and economic space in which we're to live. That the central issue in this country, I believe, between first and second peoples is for us to understand that settlement has never been completed in this place. Settlement is the agreement we make about how first and second peoples can actually exist together in the same space. As second peoples, we assume that settlement of this country, the set of relationships was determined in 1788. The British came here, they established a colony, and they determined how the settlement would live for the rest of this time. And it's not so. In 1788, when Philip came here ostensibly to build a convict colony, but in fact to take land so that they could build the things they needed for the Industrial Revolution that was unfolding in England, international law, by which we actually mean European law applied to the whole universe, said that any European nation could enforce sovereignty on any other nation that was not Christian and had not been claimed by some other nation. But the same law says that you can claim sovereignty, but you can't claim the land. That is, you can claim sovereignty, but you still have to assume that people own the land, and the only two ways to get it is buy it off them or make a treaty. We did neither. When the British arrived in this place and the rest of us came after and piled into this country, we did neither. We didn't make a treaty and we didn't buy the land. And the only attempt to buy the land, which was Batman in Melbourne and was distorted as that was overturned because people said you can't do it. Why can't you do it? Because the official narrative of this country is it's terra nullius. It was empty and unoccupied. There was nobody here capable of making treaty or selling you stuff because they didn't own it. It wasn't possible. And if you make treaty and you buy stuff, you admit that they exist and that they're sovereign and they're capable and they have a place in this space. So we had an imposed settlement, no negotiation, no working it out, which is why Aboriginal people constantly say to us, we don't agree with the settlement, we will not give up our sovereignty, and the space remains open for us to continue. The thing is, and I encourage you to hear this well, the church contributed to the doctrine of terra nullius by saying there was no God in this place. This was a theological terra nullius, a space without God. We said over the years that God has abandoned the place, not blessed the land, and the people do not know God. There is no faith basis for this people, for their sovereignty, for their ownership of the land, or any claim to wisdom into the life of us, who is the church. So here's my first challenge for you of the morning. How do you and I together, people seeking to be faithful to life, to divine life and the love of our neighbours, how do we actually move beyond covenant that is about good relationships, and try to move into a space where we can understand that it is necessary to develop a just settlement, to deal with land and treaty and sovereignty and voice? And how do we understand what it means for us to be church and to acknowledge together that we still live on stolen land? That the places that we built our churches, the places that have created the wealth for our churches, and most challengingly for me of all, every time I break bread and drink wine at that table, I bring resources that have been taken off stolen land to enable me to worship my God. How do I deal with that space? And how do I forge a different sense of belonging? Theologically, the issue is, how does the story that I brought as a Christian negotiate a treaty with the story of that divine life that has been here with First Peoples for over 60,000 years? How does the story I brought and the story of my God in this space negotiate with each other? to find another space that will enrich us all. Let me say one final thing about covenants. In the Old Testament, covenants often were open and inclusive, and they brought everybody. The second covenant with Abraham said, you will have children as many as the stars, and people will come from everywhere, and you'll all be part of the same space. Some of the other covenants, though, I've called you to be my special people, and nobody else is allowed, and if they are allowed, it's because of me. So the question for us is, what kind of covenant are we trying to build? How open and inclusive are we? Or how, having claimed a covenant with God, do we want to be just us and other people can join us on our terms in our covenant space? So let me turn to reconciliation, an issue that is deeply at the heart of the Uniting Church. We were formed in 1977 because we were committed to the reconciliation that should exist between three previous denominations. Our basis of union says that at the heart of the mission of God is the reconciliation and renewal of the whole creation. For us, reconciliation is just who we are. Politically, of course, reconciliation began out of failure. It was another step in that set of relationships that began in assimilation, then in integration, then in policies of self-determination. And then when Bob Hawke had the courage to stand before Australia before his election as Prime Minister and say, well, if I'm elected, I will have national land rights legislation for everybody, and then, of course, couldn't manage it. The next step was, well, let's do some reconciliation work. We know we've failed, but let's see if we can get together and talk to each other as friends. And that really captured people's imagination. 250,000 people walked across Sydney Harbour Bridge on that first Reconciliation Sunday. Reconciliation action plans have popped up all over the countryside. This was something that made sense to us, particularly as a church. It gave us a reason to be in political space, to contribute, and to actually do something that was right. The trouble is, talking about good relationships is a lot easier as it was with covenant than it is to actually talk about the things that have to be talked about. Reparation, self-determination, voice, land. So let me be blunt with you. I think too often, despite our very best intentions in the world, reconciliation is used by second peoples to make sure we feel less guilty than we want to feel about the world in which we live, without actually taking the steps that are needed to transform the world in the deeply costly ways that reconciliation requires. The reason for this, particularly for people in the church, is that most of what we do in social justice is framed within a social liberal understanding of the rights of individuals and the desire to ensure that every single individual is included in the community. There is an underlying assumption that we are all the same, and all we have to do is make sure everybody is included in the space that we've predetermined by the settlement that we built. So here's my second challenge for the day. We need to keep building relationships, because if you don't have relationships, you don't hear people, and if you don't hear people, you have no idea what they want, and so we impose our view of what people want on the world. But the issue isn't greater understanding in itself. It's not just having mates who are black people. It's about what it means to have those relationships to make sure that other things occur in the world. There is an ongoing need for reparation and putting things right. There's a need to form a new set of rules around settlement. There's a need to honour 60,000 years of existence in this space. So let me say to you why it is, having outlined that challenge and that deep disturbance of our life, I don't simply despair and go and hide under my bed. Jesus said that the central commandments for us are to love God and to love our neighbours as we love ourselves. I imagine God, in my imagining of the world, I imagine God as a divine community of relationships, held together by the deepest of love and capacity to make space for others in life. I believe that when Jesus said to love God and our neighbours, it was not a commandment, it was an invitation. It was an invitation to enter into the deep life of God, that swirling, dancing, amazing life that is God, in such a way that my life is constantly being transformed. And out of the capacity to be transformed, I gain a little bit of the capacity to love God and to love my neighbours, and to hope that the God whose life I enter will sustain me and does sustain me. So I hope in this time you may experience that invitation of that God and of that grace, and sustain each other in divine life and in the deep love of your neighbour. Amen.